Angela Whitfield sat quietly in her wheelchair in the middle of a marble lobby, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a receptionist who had just laughed in her face. The laugh was not loud, but it carried, the kind of laugh people use when they think no one important is listening. Angela did not flinch. She had learned a long time ago that the moment you react, you hand people power over you, and she had no intention of handing anyone anything that morning. The receptionist, a young woman named Kimberly Doss, leaned toward her coworker and said just loud enough for Angela to hear that some people wheel themselves in here like this is a shelter and not a place of business. Angela kept her eyes forward. She had heard worse. She had lived through worse. But this morning was different, because in a few short minutes, Kimberly Doss was going to understand exactly who she had been laughing at. Kimberly straightened her blazer, glanced at the clock, and turned back toward Angela, with a tight, dismissive smile. "Ma'am," she said, her voice cool and clipped. "This isn't a homeless shelter. You'll need to leave." The words landed in the lobby like a slammed door, and for one long second, nobody moved. Angela did not raise her voice. She did not ask to speak to a supervisor. She simply looked at Kimberly, the way a mother looks at a child who has said something they will regret, and said nothing at all. I want you to remember her face in this moment, because in 4 minutes, Kimberly Doss was going to watch her entire career end right in front of me, and she had no idea it was coming. What she did not know, what nobody in that lobby knew, was whose name was sitting quietly on the ownership papers of the very building she stood in. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Here is what nobody in that lobby understood that morning. The woman they saw as an inconvenience, a woman in a wheelchair wearing a plain gray coat and carrying an old leather handbag, was not a visitor who had wandered in off the street. She was not lost, and she was not confused. She was there because she owned 51% of Sterling Crest Financial, the company whose name was engraved in gold letters above the front doors she had just rolled through. She had built that ownership quietly over the better part of a decade, never once putting her own name on a press release, never once appearing in a company photo, because she had learned early in life that people show you exactly who they are the moment they believe you have nothing to offer them. That morning, she had come to see for herself. 3 questions were about to answer themselves in that lobby, though nobody there knew the questions were even being asked. Why would a woman who controlled the majority of the company sit unannounced and unrecognized in her own building? Why did she let the humiliation continue instead of stopping it the second it began? And what was she really there to uncover that no board meeting or quarterly report had ever shown her? She had heard the complaints for months, quiet ones, passed along through people who trusted her enough to speak honestly. Complaints about how certain visitors were treated at the front desk, complaints that never made it into any official file. So she came herself, in the plainest coat she owned, to see if the stories were true. I had come to that building for one reason that morning, and it had nothing to do with a wheelchair, or a receptionist, or the way she looked at me, like I did not belong in a place my late husband had helped build from nothing. I came because I needed to see with my own eyes whether the values we had built this company on were still standing, or whether they had quietly been replaced while no one who mattered was watching. I did not expect to find my answer within the first 10 minutes of walking through the door. But sometimes the truth does not wait for you to be ready for it. Sometimes it introduces itself the moment you sit still long enough to let it. To understand why that morning mattered so much to me, you have to go back almost 30 years. Long before Sterling Crest Financial had gold letters above its doors. Long before I had ever touched a boardroom table. I grew up in a small house on the edge of a working-class neighborhood in Ohio, the oldest of 4 children, raised mostly by my grandmother after my mother passed when I was 12. We did not have much, but my grandmother believed that dignity was not something money bought you, it was something you carried inside yourself, no matter what anyone else thought of you. She used to tell me that people will try to measure your worth by what they can see, your clothes, your car, the way you walk into a room, but the truth of a person lives in what they carry when nobody is applauding them for it. I carried that lesson with me longer than I carried almost anything else she gave me. I remember one afternoon, not long after my grandmother took over raising us, when she took me with her to a small neighborhood bank to open a savings account with the little money she had managed to set aside. The teller behind the counter looked at her worn coat, glanced at the address on her identification, and told her, without much patience, that the minimum deposit required was higher than what she had brought that day. My grandmother did not argue. She simply nodded, thanked the teller, and walked us both back out into the cold. On the bus ride home, she told me something I never forgot, that some doors are built to test whether you will still hold your head up after they close in your face. and that the true measure of a person is not whether doors open for them, but how they carry themselves when those doors do not. I did not understand the full weight of that lesson until decades later, sitting in a wheelchair in my own lobby, listening to a young woman decide in half a second that I did not belong there either. I met my husband, Marcus Whitfield, when I was 23 years old, working the front counter of a small check cashing office 2 blocks from where I lived. Marcus was quiet, methodical, the kind of man who counted every dollar twice, not because he did not trust the world, but because he respected what a dollar represented to people who did not have very many of them. He started Sterling Crest Financial with 2 other partners in a rented office above a laundromat, offering small loans and financial guidance to families the bigger banks refused to even meet with. I worked beside him in those early years, answering phones, balancing ledgers by hand, learning every piece of that business from the ground up, long before it ever became the company whose name now sits on a 40-story building downtown. We built it together, quietly, stubbornly, one client at a time. I still remember one of our very first clients, a widow named Dorothy, who came to us needing a small loan to repair the roof of the house she had lived in for 30 years. A house that every bank in town had refused to even discuss with her, because her income came from a modest pension rather than a steady paycheck. Marcus sat with her for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, not because the loan itself was complicated, but because he wanted her to leave our office understanding exactly what she was signing and exactly how she would repay it, something no other institution had ever bothered to explain to her in plain language. When Dorothy passed away years later, her daughter told us that Ruth had held strong through every storm that hit that house afterward, and that her mother had spoken of Marcus's patience until the very end of her life. That was the standard Marcus set for every employee who ever worked behind our counters, and it was the standard I expected still lived somewhere inside the walls of that lobby, even after everything had grown so much larger than the 2 of us. When Marcus passed away 11 years ago, many people assumed I would sell my shares and step back from the company entirely, and for a while, grief made that seem like the easier path. But something in me refused to let go of what we had built with our bare hands. Instead of stepping back, I made a decision that surprised even our closest friends. I began buying shares quietly, through a holding company that carried none of my personal identity, slowly consolidating ownership until I controlled the majority stake without ever needing my name printed anywhere. I did not do this for power. I did this because I wanted to protect what Marcus and I had built, and I wanted to be able to walk into any branch of that company, unannounced and unrecognized, and see exactly how it was treating the people who walked through its doors. For years, that arrangement worked exactly as I intended. I visited branches quietly, dressed plainly, sometimes using a cane, sometimes simply blending into a waiting room chair, and what I saw mostly reassured me. Employees who greeted people with patience, managers who remembered names, a culture that still resembled the one Marcus and I had poured our lives into. But 3 years ago, everything about how I moved through the world changed after a car accident left me reliant on a wheelchair for the rest of my life. I will not pretend that adjustment was simple. There were nights I mourned the version of myself that used to walk into rooms without a second thought from anyone. But I also discovered something the accident had not taken from me, a new and uncomfortable window into how the world treats people it assumes have nothing to offer. About a year after the accident, I visited one of our smaller branches on the outskirts of the city, still testing how comfortable I felt moving through public spaces in my wheelchair. A young manager there, a man barely out of his 20s, spent nearly 20 minutes helping me fill out a simple form, patiently adjusting his own chair to sit at my eye level, rather than standing over me the way so many people instinctively do without realizing how it feels from below. He had no idea who I was that day, only that an older woman needed help, and he gave that help fully, without hesitation or performance. I left that branch reassured, believing the values Marcus and I had built were still alive in the newer generation of employees coming up through the company. That memory made the coldness I encountered at the downtown headquarters even harder to reconcile, because I knew firsthand that patience and dignity were not impossible standards to meet. They were simply standards that required someone, somewhere, to keep insisting on them. In the months leading up to that morning at Sterling Crest's downtown headquarters, quiet complaints had begun reaching me through people who still trusted me enough to speak honestly. Employees who did not know I owned the majority stake, who simply knew me as a widow who occasionally stopped by to ask questions. The complaints were never dramatic on their own. A visitor kept waiting far longer than necessary, a client redirected to a side entrance without explanation, a wheelchair user told the elevator was under maintenance when it clearly was not. Individually, each story could be dismissed as an isolated misunderstanding. Together, they formed a pattern I could not ignore, a pattern that suggested something had shifted at the front doors of the company that still carried my husband's fingerprints on every wall. So on that particular Tuesday morning, I made a decision I had not made in over a year. I put on the plainest gray coat I owned, the same coat I wore to grocery stores and church sales, and I asked my driver to take me to the downtown headquarters instead of the private entrance reserved for board members. I did not call ahead. I did not notify the general manager. I wanted to walk, or rather roll, through those front doors exactly the way an ordinary visitor would, with no protection from my name and no expectation of special treatment. I told myself I was simply gathering information, quietly confirming or dismissing what I had heard. I did not yet know how quickly and how painfully that information was about to confirm itself. The lobby of Sterling Crest's headquarters was designed to impress. Marble floors that caught the morning light, a soaring ceiling, a reception desk carved from dark wood that Marcus himself had chosen the year the building opened. I remembered helping select that very desk, running my hand along its surface, and imagining the families it would welcome for decades to come. That morning, I rolled toward that same desk as a woman nobody recognized, carrying an old leather handbag and wearing shoes that had seen better years. Behind the desk sat Kimberly Doss, 26 years old, according to the employee badge clipped to her blazer, scrolling through her phone with the kind of boredom that suggested she had not yet noticed me approaching. I waited patiently at the desk for nearly 4 minutes before Kimberly looked up, and when she finally did, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The practiced politeness reserved for expected clients replaced by something colder, something that assessed me in half a second and decided I did not warrant her full attention. She asked, without much interest, what my business was that morning. I told her I was there to speak with someone in management about an account inquiry, deliberately vague, wanting to see how far the conversation would go before anyone asked who I actually was. Kimberly glanced toward the elevator bank, then back at me, and said the general manager was extremely busy that morning and unlikely to have time for walk-in visitors, especially ones without an appointment already confirmed in the system. I asked politely if I could simply wait, gesturing toward the small seating area near the window, the same chairs Marcus had personally selected for comfort rather than appearance. Kimberly hesitated, then suggested, with a tone that made the suggestion feel more like a directive, that I might be more comfortable waiting near the side door instead, closer to the exit, out of the way of the morning foot traffic. I understood immediately what she meant, though she never said it outright. She wanted me positioned somewhere less visible, somewhere that would not disrupt the polished image of the lobby for the executives and clients passing through. I chose to stay exactly where I was, near the window, in plain sight, and simply thanked her for her concern. It was in that moment that Kimberly turned toward her coworker, a young man seated at a second desk nearby, and made the comment that would follow her for the rest of her career at that company. She said, not quite under her breath but not quite openly either, that some people wheel themselves in here like the place is a shelter and not a business. Her coworker gave an uncomfortable half-laugh, glancing at me briefly before looking away, clearly unsure whether to acknowledge what had just been said. I did not react. I had absorbed comments like that one for most of my adult life, long before the wheelchair, long before the gray hair, simply for being a black woman who did not announce her worth the moment she walked into a room. I simply folded my hands and waited. 10 more minutes passed, and I asked again, calmly, if I could speak with someone in management, explaining that my matter was time-sensitive and important. This time, Kimberly's patience visibly thinned. She stood from behind the desk, walked around toward where I sat, and said the words that would echo through every conversation that followed for weeks afterward. "Ma'am," she said, loudly enough now that several people crossing the lobby turned to look. "This isn't a homeless shelter. You'll need to leave." The words hit the marble floor and seemed to hang there, suspended, while every person within earshot froze in place. I looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, but with something closer to sorrow, because I understood in that instant exactly what kind of culture had been allowed to grow unchecked in a building my husband had built, to serve people exactly like the woman she assumed I was. I did not argue with Kimberly. I did not raise my voice or demand an apology. Instead, I reached into my handbag, retrieved my phone, and placed a single call to a number that very few people at that company had ever dialed directly. The private line of the general manager, a man named Robert Callahan, who had held that position for almost 6 years. Robert answered on the second ring, his voice warm and professional, clearly unaware of who was calling him from an unfamiliar number. I asked him calmly to come down to the main lobby immediately, without explaining why, and something in my tone must have carried more weight than my words, because he agreed instantly, promising to be there within moments. While I waited, Kimberly remained standing near her desk, visibly irritated but also visibly satisfied. believing she had successfully handled what she perceived as an unwanted disruption to her morning. She did not know that Robert Callahan recognized my voice the moment I spoke, because I had spoken with him privately on more than one occasion regarding matters only the majority shareholder would be consulted about. She did not know that within the walls of that company, very few names carried more weight than mine, precisely because I had spent years ensuring almost nobody knew to attach that weight to my face. She simply saw a woman in a wheelchair who had refused to leave when asked, and she assumed, as so many had assumed before her, that refusal meant confusion rather than certainty. The elevator doors opened perhaps 3 minutes later, and Robert Callahan walked out at a pace that bordered on running, his tie slightly loosened, his expression somewhere between confusion and alarm. He scanned the lobby quickly until his eyes landed on me, and the moment they did, his entire posture changed, his shoulders dropping, his face draining of color. He walked directly toward me, ignoring Kimberly entirely, and said my name, not as a question, but as a confirmation, Mrs. Whitfield, before turning sharply toward the reception desk, where Kimberly now stood frozen, her earlier irritation replaced by a rising panic she did not yet fully understand the depth of. Robert's voice rose, not out of theater but out of genuine disbelief, as he said the words that would later be repeated by nearly everyone who witnessed that morning. She owns 51% of us. The lobby fell into a silence. I can still hear clearly whenever I close my eyes and remember that morning. Kimberly's face shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally a kind of horror that comes from realizing a mistake cannot be undone with an apology alone. Her co-worker at the second desk sat frozen, phone forgotten in his hand. Two other employees who had been crossing the lobby stopped entirely, watching the scene unfold with the kind of stillness reserved for moments people instinctively know they will remember for years. Robert Callahan turned back toward me, apologizing repeatedly, offering to escort me anywhere I needed to go, clearly terrified of what my presence that morning might mean for his own position within the company. I raised my hand gently, asking him to lower his voice, not because I wanted to protect Kimberly from consequences, but because I had learned long ago that dignity should never be sacrificed, even in moments of justified anger. I asked Robert to walk with me to his office, and as we moved through the lobby, I noticed something that would matter far more than Kimberly's immediate humiliation: the way several employees exchanged glances with each other. Glances that suggested this was not the first time concerns about how visitors were treated at the front desk had circulated quietly through the building. I filed that observation away carefully because I sensed that Kimberly Doss was not the true root of the problem I had come looking for. She was simply the most visible symptom of something much larger that had been allowed to grow unchecked for far longer than one single morning. Inside Robert's office, I asked him directly how long complaints about the front desk had been circulating without reaching my attention, and his hesitation told me everything before he even spoke a word. He admitted, reluctantly, that over the past 18 months, at least 6 formal complaints had been filed by clients regarding how they were treated in the main lobby. Complaints that ranged from long unexplained waits to outright refusals of service, disproportionately affecting visitors who were older, visitors with disabilities, and visitors who did not fit whatever unspoken image of importance had quietly taken hold within that branch. He explained that these complaints had been handled internally, quietly resolved through brief conversations and informal warnings, never escalated to the board, because doing so might have drawn unwanted scrutiny toward his own management of the branch. I asked Robert why none of these 6 complaints had ever been compiled into a single report that might reveal the pattern hiding within them, and his answer, though carefully worded, revealed exactly what I feared. He admitted that addressing the pattern directly would have required acknowledging that his branch had developed a culture of quietly discouraging certain types of clients, a culture that, uncomfortably, had coincided with improved efficiency metrics and shorter average wait times for the clients who remained. In other words, turning away difficult or time-consuming visitors had quietly made his numbers look better on paper, and he had allowed that unspoken incentive to override the values the company was supposed to represent. Hearing him say this aloud confirmed what I had suspected the moment I decided to visit that morning unannounced. I sat across from Robert for a long while after he admitted this, watching him struggle to meet my eyes, and I found myself thinking not just about the company, but about how quietly this kind of quiet neglect spreads inside any institution once nobody with real authority insists on stopping it. It rarely announces itself loudly. It builds through small permissions, a shortened wait time here, a slightly colder greeting there, until one day, it has become simply how things are done, no longer questioned by anyone still working inside it. Robert had not set out to build an unwelcoming branch when he first took the role 6 years earlier. He had simply allowed convenience to accumulate, decision by small decision, until convenience had quietly become the culture, and none of us at the top had been paying close enough attention to notice the shift before it reached my own front doors. I asked to see the personnel files connected to each of the 6 prior complaints, along with the training records for every employee working the front desk over the past 2 years. Robert complied immediately, understanding that refusal was no longer an option available to him. As I reviewed those files that afternoon, a clearer picture began forming, one that extended well beyond Kimberly Doss and her 4 minutes of cruelty in the lobby. Several employees had received informal verbal warnings for similar behavior, warnings that were never documented formally, never tied to any real consequence, simply quiet conversations meant to make problems disappear from view, rather than genuinely correcting them. Kimberly herself, I discovered, had received one such informal warning nearly 8 months earlier, a warning that clearly had done nothing to change her behavior because nothing about it had ever felt real to her. One complaint in particular stopped me completely as I read through the files that afternoon. An elderly veteran named Harold, 81 years old, had come into the same lobby 4 months earlier, seeking help consolidating a small pension account, using a cane, and moving slowly across the marble floor. According to the written complaint his daughter later filed on his behalf, he had been told to wait outside near the parking garage rather than in the lobby, supposedly because the front seating area was reserved for scheduled appointments only, though no such policy existed anywhere in our official guidelines. He waited outside in the cold for nearly 40 minutes before his daughter arrived and insisted he be allowed back inside. Reading his daughter's written account, describing her father's quiet embarrassment as he sat outside a building he had banked with for over a decade, I felt something harden inside me that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with the promise Marcus and I had made to people exactly like Harold when we first opened our doors above that laundromat. I asked Robert directly why Harold's complaint, so clearly documented and so clearly serious, had never once reached my desk or the board's attention in the 4 months since it was filed. Robert admitted that the complaint had been logged internally, a brief note added to the branch's general customer service file, and a verbal reminder given to the staff present that day about maintaining lobby seating for scheduled visitors, without any specific accountability attached to any individual employee. He acknowledged, when I pressed him further, that treating each complaint as an isolated incident, rather than connecting them into a visible pattern, had allowed the branch to avoid the kind of scrutiny that might have forced real change much earlier. Hearing Harold's story confirmed for me that Kimberly's actions that Tuesday morning were not an aberration born from nowhere, but the latest and most visible expression of a culture that had been quietly tolerated for far longer than anyone above her had been willing to admit. That evening, sitting alone in my study with those personnel files spread across my desk, I found myself thinking less about anger and more about responsibility. Marcus and I had built Sterling Crest Financial specifically to serve people the larger banks refused to acknowledge, families who had been dismissed, underestimated, and quietly pushed aside their entire lives. Somewhere along the way, without either of us fully realizing it while grief consumed my attention after his passing, the branch closest to our own headquarters had begun repeating the exact patterns of dismissal we had built our entire company to correct. I understood then that firing Kimberly Doss alone would solve nothing meaningful. It would simply remove one visible symptom while leaving the deeper infection untouched, ready to resurface in someone else's voice within a matter of months. The following morning, I returned to Sterling Crest's headquarters, though this time I arrived through the main entrance in full view, having notified the board of directors the night before that I intended to address the branch directly. Word had already spread quickly through the building about what had happened in the lobby the previous day, and I could feel the shift in atmosphere the moment I entered, a mixture of anxiety and curiosity settling over every employee I passed. Robert Callahan met me at the elevator, visibly exhausted, having spent much of the previous evening compiling a complete accounting of every complaint the branch had quietly absorbed over the past 2 years, without ever escalating them appropriately. I asked Robert to gather the entire lobby staff, including Kimberly Doss, for a meeting that afternoon, explaining clearly that I did not intend this gathering to be a public shaming, but rather an honest conversation about what kind of company we were actually going to be moving forward. When the staff assembled in the small conference room adjacent to the lobby, I could see the fear clearly written across Kimberly's face, the fear of a young woman who understood she was likely about to lose the only job she had held since finishing college 2 years earlier. I began not by addressing her directly, but by addressing the entire room, explaining who I was, why I had chosen for years to remain quietly unseen within my own company, and why that particular Tuesday morning had finally convinced me the time for quiet observation had ended. I told them the story of how Marcus and I had built this company from a rented office above a laundromat, serving families who had been turned away by every bank downtown. Families who reminded me deeply of my own upbringing, on the edge of a working-class neighborhood in Ohio. I explained that the entire foundation of Sterling Crest Financial rested on the promise that no client, regardless of how they looked, how they moved, or what assumptions a stranger might make about their worth, would ever be dismissed at our front doors, the way so many of us had been dismissed elsewhere throughout our lives. I watched several employees lower their eyes as I spoke, clearly recognizing themselves somewhere within the pattern I described, whether through direct participation or through silent complicity in simply looking away. One employee, a young man named Marcus Ellery, who had worked the second desk beside Kimberly for nearly a year, raised his hand quietly partway through my remarks and asked if he could speak. He admitted, his voice unsteady, that he had witnessed several of the moments I was describing without ever intervening, telling himself each time that it was not his place to correct a coworker, or that reporting Kimberly might make him seem disloyal to someone he considered a friend. He apologized, not just to me, but to Kimberly herself, for staying silent when speaking up might have stopped this pattern long before it ever reached a Tuesday morning in the main lobby. I told him, and everyone else listening, that his honesty that afternoon mattered more than any silence ever could have, and that Sterling Crest Financial would need far more employees willing to speak that same kind of truth if we were ever going to close the distance between what we claim to value and how we actually treated the people who walked through our doors. When I finally turned my attention to Kimberly directly, the room grew completely still. I did not raise my voice. I did not repeat her exact words back to her for effect. Instead, I asked her a single question: why she had assumed, the moment she saw me roll through those front doors, that I had nothing meaningful to offer that building. Kimberly's voice shook as she answered, admitting through tears that she had simply reacted the way she had seen others react before her, that nobody had ever specifically trained her on how to treat visitors who did not fit the polished image she believed the lobby was supposed to project. Her answer was honest, and in its honesty, it revealed something important: that her failure was not purely personal cruelty, but the predictable result of a culture nobody above her had bothered to correct. I told Kimberly, and the rest of the room, that I had decided against simply terminating her employment on the spot, though many people who later heard this story questioned why I extended her that grace. I explained my reasoning clearly. Firing her immediately would have felt satisfying for exactly one afternoon, but it would have solved nothing structural within the company. Instead, I outlined a different path, one that required far more from her than a simple apology. Kimberly would be required to complete comprehensive training on disability awareness and customer dignity, training that Sterling Crest Financial would now mandate for every front-facing employee company-wide. She would remain on formal probation for 6 months, with her progress reviewed personally by both Robert Callahan and myself, and she would be required to stand before her fellow employees, as she was doing that very afternoon, and account honestly for what she had done, rather than allowing the incident to quietly disappear the way 6 prior complaints already had. Robert Callahan did not receive the same grace I extended to Kimberly. I informed him privately, later that same day, that his position as general manager would not continue beyond the transition period necessary to train a replacement. I explained that his failure was, in many ways, more serious than Kimberly's, because he had possessed both the authority and the responsibility to correct this pattern long before it ever reached the lobby that Tuesday morning, and he had instead allowed it to continue because it quietly benefited his own performance metrics. Kimberly had failed because nobody had properly guided her. Robert had failed because he had been guided perfectly well and had chosen convenience over the values the company was built upon. Choosing Robert's replacement took several weeks, and I insisted on being personally involved in every interview, something I had rarely done for a single branch manager position in years. I wanted someone who understood, without needing to be told twice, that efficiency should never be built on the quiet exclusion of the very people our company existed to serve. We eventually promoted a woman named Patricia Wynn from within the branch itself, someone who had spent nearly 9 years working her way up from a teller position, and who had once quietly reported concerns about lobby treatment to Robert directly, only to be told the matter would be handled internally and to let it go. Patricia's first act as branch manager was to personally review every open complaint filed over the previous 2 years, and to schedule a follow-up call with each affected client, including Harold, to apologize directly and offer whatever remaining assistance his account still required. I remember Harold's daughter telling me, weeks later, that her father cried on that phone call, not out of sadness, but because he had genuinely believed nobody at that company would ever acknowledge what he had endured that cold afternoon in the parking garage. In the weeks that followed, Sterling Crest Financial implemented changes across every branch, not just the downtown headquarters. Mandatory training on dignity, disability awareness, and unconscious bias became a permanent part of onboarding for every employee who worked directly with clients. A new, confidential reporting system was established specifically so that complaints like the 6 that had quietly disappeared under Robert's management could never again be buried without reaching the board's attention. I made a personal commitment to continue my quiet, unannounced visits to branches across the company, not as punishment, but as a promise to Marcus that the values we built together would never again be allowed to erode, simply because nobody with real power was watching closely enough. The board meeting where I first presented these changes was unlike any meeting I had sat through in the 11 years since Marcus passed. Several board members initially questioned whether mandatory company-wide training was truly necessary in response to what they characterized as a single employee's isolated lapse in judgment, arguing that Kimberly's behavior, however regrettable, did not necessarily reflect a broader institutional problem. I laid Harold's complaint alongside the 5 others on the table in front of them, along with a simple chart showing how each complaint had been quietly resolved without ever reaching a level of scrutiny that might have revealed the pattern connecting them. I watched the room grow quiet as they read through the details themselves, understanding slowly that this was never about one receptionist's 4 minutes of cruelty, but about a system that had made it remarkably easy for cruelty like hers to go unexamined for as long as it remained profitable and convenient. By the end of that meeting, the vote to implement company-wide changes passed without a single objection. I also insisted that the new confidential reporting system include a provision ensuring that no employee filing a complaint against a manager or coworker could face retaliation of any kind, a protection that had never formally existed within our policies before that Tuesday morning forced me to examine them closely. Too many of the 6 prior complaints, I discovered, had gone unescalated, partly because the employees who witnessed them feared that speaking up honestly might cost them their own standing within the branch, exactly the fear Marcus Ellery admitted to during our staff meeting. Protecting the people willing to tell the truth, I came to understand, mattered just as much as correcting the people who had failed to live up to it, because a reporting system nobody feels safe enough to actually use is nothing more than a document sitting quietly in a drawer, waiting for its own moment of crisis to reveal how empty it truly was. Kimberly Doss completed her 6 months of probation, and something genuinely unexpected happened during that time. Rather than resenting the consequences of that morning, she leaned into them, eventually becoming one of the strongest voices within the company, advocating for the very training she had once desperately needed herself. She spoke at internal meetings about her own mistake with a level of honesty that surprised even me, using her own humiliation as a teaching tool for newer employees who might otherwise repeat the same assumptions she once carried without question. I watched her transform, slowly and imperfectly, from the young woman who once told me this isn't a homeless shelter, into someone who genuinely understood what it meant to see every client who walked through those doors as a full human being deserving of patience and respect. About 4 months into her probation, Kimberly asked Patricia if she could personally call Harold to apologize, having learned his story during one of the mandatory training sessions she now helped facilitate for newer hires. Patricia arranged the call, though she warned Kimberly that Harold might not want to speak with anyone from the branch at all after everything he had endured. Harold agreed to take the call, and according to Patricia, who sat quietly in the room while it happened, Kimberly's voice shook through most of the conversation as she apologized not just for her own actions toward me, but for the culture she now understood she had absorbed rather than questioned. Harold, in his gentle way, told her that everyone deserves the chance to become better than their worst afternoon, provided they are willing to do the work required to earn that chance, and that he appreciated her call more than she likely understood. Kimberly later told me that conversation changed something in her more permanently than my own words in that conference room ever had, because it came from someone she had personally harmed, rather than from the woman who owned the company. By the end of her probationary period, Kimberly had become the person newer front desk employees were assigned to shadow during their first week, not because the company wanted to make an example of her mistake, but because she had genuinely become one of the most attentive and patient people working that lobby. I remember visiting the branch nearly a year after that original Tuesday morning, once again unannounced, once again dressed plainly, curious whether the changes we had implemented were holding, or whether they had quietly faded the way so many corporate initiatives eventually do, once the initial attention passes. Kimberly did not recognize me at first, focused entirely on helping an elderly man in a wheelchair navigate a complicated withdrawal request, kneeling slightly to meet his eye level exactly the way that young branch manager once met mine. When she finally noticed me watching from across the lobby, her face broke into a smile that carried none of the coldness from that first morning, only a quiet pride in how far she had traveled since then. I think about that morning often, not with anger, but with a strange kind of gratitude, because it forced a confrontation that had been necessary for far longer than anyone realized. I did not choose to reveal my ownership that day, out of vanity or a desire for power. I chose it because silence, Even quiet, observant silence eventually reaches a point where it stops protecting the people it was meant to serve. Marcus used to tell me that a company is never truly built once and left finished. It is rebuilt every single day through the choices its people make when they believe nobody important is watching. That Tuesday morning taught me, painfully and clearly, that even the company we built together with our own hands could drift from its foundation if I allowed comfort and distance to replace vigilance. I often wonder what would have happened if I had simply turned my wheelchair around that morning and left, the way Kimberly demanded I do. Perhaps the pattern would have continued quietly for years, absorbed and buried the way 6 prior complaints already had been, until it eventually reached someone with far less patience than I carried that day. I share this story now not to condemn one young receptionist who made a devastating mistake in a single moment of assumption, but to ask something of everyone listening. How many times have you looked at someone, assessed them in half a second, and decided silently that they had nothing meaningful to offer you, only to discover later how wrong that assumption truly was? Would you have recognized who I really was that morning, or would you have judged me exactly the way Kimberly did, before ever giving me the chance to prove otherwise? I think, too, about how easily this story could have ended differently, how easily I could have been someone without 51% of a company, sitting quietly behind my name, someone who truly had nowhere else to turn that morning, someone for whom Kimberly's words would have been the final blow in a day already full of them. Most people who are dismissed at a front desk somewhere in this country do not own the building they are standing in. Most people who are told to wait outside in the cold do not have a daughter capable of filing a formal complaint that eventually reaches a company's board of directors. Most people simply absorb the moment, carry it home, and add it quietly to a lifetime of similar moments nobody ever apologizes for. That truth sits heavier with me than anything else this story taught me, because it means Kimberly's mistake was not rare. It was simply the version of it that happened to intersect with someone who had the power to insist on consequences and change. I have thought often about what it would mean if more people carried Harold's grace rather than my own initial silence, choosing to speak up the moment they witnessed someone else being dismissed, rather than waiting for the dismissed person to somehow prove their own worth after the fact. Marcus used to say that the true test of any company, or any person, is not how they treat the people who can clearly help them, but how they treat the people who appear, at first glance, to offer nothing in return. That Tuesday morning was never really about a wheelchair, or a receptionist, or 51% of a company. It was about a promise Marcus and I made to each other above a laundromat 3 decades ago. A promise that every single person who walked through our doors would be seen fully, regardless of what they were wearing, how they moved, or what assumptions a stranger might form about them, in the 4 seconds before actually getting to know who they really were. If this story moved you the way it moved me to live through it, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you truly were? Or have you ever caught yourself making the same assumption Kimberly made that morning, before you had all the facts in front of you? Share your story with us, because these conversations matter more than any single video ever could. And if you found value in walking through this journey with me today, please consider subscribing to this channel, so you never miss the next story we bring you, because there are many more mornings, many more lobbies, and many more lessons still waiting to be told.